Welcome to Leadership Pulse podcast. I'm your host, Jay Sharma. On this show, as you know, we invite various tech leaders and thought leaders to come and discuss topics that are of interest to you. Today, I have Christopher Chin with me, who is a leadership communication coach. And we will be diving into the importance of communication and how it can help accelerate your career. Take a moment and introduce yourself.
Thanks so much, Jay, for having me on. I started my journey in a very different field from communication, let alone tech. I started off as a composer, and my great dream was to become a Hollywood film composer one day, write music for the movies and make people laugh and cry and feel inspired by the soundtracks. I eventually pivoted into tech because I wanted a career that was more financially stable and where I could grow and also be creative. And that's where I came upon the data industry, where I found a position as an analyst, creating visualizations, charts, telling stories with data. So for me, for a time, it was a perfect blend of my creative half and also my logical, rational half. And I was nurturing both. But over time, I realized that I had deviated from my original dream. I was doing a lot more work building products, looking at numbers on a screen for hours every day. And I realized I was really missing working with people. I was building products, but I really wanted to get back to building people. And I decided in 2023, last year, to take a leap, try something daring, and build my own business, see if it would work out. And what I chose was something I identified as a gap within the tech and data industry, which is communication. I saw so many of my colleagues, geniuses at their craft, extremely technically proficient, but reached a ceiling in their career development because of communication skills. If they weren't able to confidently present their material, to speak up during meetings, they were often overlooked in favor of people who demonstrated those communication skills. And I thought that was such a shame. Why can't every tech professional who has the potential to be a leader communicate like one? And that became the mission of my work. I said, I'm going to go out there, do private coaching, online courses, workshops for companies. I'm going to hopefully make a difference for every tech professional I work with and help them reach their maximum potential. So now I feel like when I work with people, they do laugh, they do cry, they do feel inspired, but not because I'm telling stories with them or writing music for them, but because they're telling their own stories confidently and authentically with their own voice. And that to me is the most rewarding.
That's really wonderful, and good luck to you in your new venture. So let's jump right into the conversation and start with, why is effective communication so important in our both professional and personal lives?
I had someone reach out to me recently to work on their communication skills. And I asked them, what is the reason why this is urgent for you to work on now? And they said to me, because of AI. And with the advent of AI, ChatGPT, all these different technologies that can generate things automatically and very efficiently, a lot of us in the tech industry are becoming afraid it'll take away our jobs. Because while in the past, I would write line by line all the code to make something run, now ChatGPT can create it within a few seconds. And it can do that for every language that exists. And that's frightening for a lot of people. I don't believe that AI will immediately take all our jobs. I believe more so that it's an augmenter. We still need the expertise within the field to direct it, to correct its mistakes. But at the end of the day, ChatGPT and other AI will automate a large portion of our work, and we need to adapt to that and use it as an ally. It will allow us to devote more time to the essential part of business, which is human connection, developing relationships, working with stakeholders, that part that can't be automated. And for that reason, communication becomes essential in this increasingly fast and modern world to be able to create that human connection authentically and confidently.
I can totally relate to it because I've had very similar numerous conversation about, will AI take our jobs, right? Like my point of view on this is, it's probably not AI that's going to take your job. It's probably a human that leverages AI who will take your job. But to our our core of our theme today, um, how it is more important today than it was yesterday. Like human connections were important yesterday too. Like before ChatGPT came in existence, like late 2022, it was always important, at least from where I can see. Why suddenly now?
I believe that with AI, being able to generate code, generate text, a lot of us may fall into the pitfall of using it to create all of our content. And we can see this, both of us being on LinkedIn, a lot of posts and content is AI generated. And there are advantages to that. It's fast, it's efficient. But if we use it to create all of our words, when do we practice communicating ourselves? If we have AI generate all our presentations, all our storytelling, all of our reports, if we're in a boardroom with an executive and they ask us on the spot to communicate to them what's going on, we won't be able to do that because we haven't exercised that muscle. So it's not necessarily that communication is more important now than before. It's always been important. But now there's an easier tendency to let machines, AI, and tools take over a portion of our work and let us forget how to apply it in our day-to-day.
Is it fair to say that with ChatGPT, our communication skills are regressing?
I wouldn't say that necessarily. It's been, I believe, 2 years or so since ChatGPT was released. But I believe we can see it kind of with presentations. Ever since PowerPoint was created, a lot of us rely on the tool and the technology to do the speaking for us. You see a lot of slides that are filled with walls of text, and then people just read off of it instead of standing there and giving the presentation themselves, as was done perhaps before. With any new tool that's created, there's this rush to use it in everything. And we have to be careful to use it carefully and to, as to your point before, to augment our work as an ally, to use it effectively for our own day-to-day tasks rather than let it take over everything. So a complement rather than a replacement.
I think this is a nice segue because you started touching onto various kind of pitfalls. So my next question to you is, what are the common pitfalls that someone should watch for when it comes to effective communication?
A big one would be the one that I mentioned previously, which is slides that are covered with a lot of text. I was working with one client who was a PhD in molecular oncology, really brilliant scientific researcher. And originally, he didn't really believe in the importance of communication. He'd spent a lot of time in the lab doing that kind of research work. But he had an important interview coming up and he reached out and said, hey, I think I should work on this now. I think it's important that I present myself well in this interview. I can't just type it all out and read it to them. I have to present it to them. So the original slides that he sent to me had all of the things he wanted to say on them. And I said, what is the difference between you sending that to all the people on the interview panel versus you being there? And there is no difference. You are not adding any value to the presentation because it's all there on the slide deck. So I said, in the same way that AI must complement rather than replace us, your slides need to complement rather than replace you. So you must be the leader and the driver of the slides, not the slide deck itself. And that distinction, understanding that you are the presentation, not the tools you're using for the presentation, is key to avoid, especially within our industry.
Let me delve into this because I've been in the industry for over 2 decades now, and I've seen this firsthand. A lot of the times, these slide decks that are created for one presentation, the decks actually outlive that presentation. Like they are shared over and over again as the time goes by. And if these slide decks are just to augment the original presentation, they would not be able to share. Like a person just looking at the slide deck would not be able to connect the dots. How should one think about that purpose?
This is one of the most challenging things for technical presentations. And I was at a data storytelling workshop recently, a few weeks ago, and this question was asked. And my response was, ideally, in an ideal world where we have unlimited amount of time to work on our material, we would have one deck for the presentation and one deck for the sending after the presentation, the documentation that outlives it. Because during the presentation, we don't want people to be distracted by all the text present. We want them to pay attention to us and the story that we're telling them. Then after the presentation, we send the separate deck that everyone can reference and read on their own time. In the business world, that never happens, that we have an unlimited amount of time. So to fuse those two together, what I recommend is the main presentation deck has the minimal amount of information present so you can present it well and people pay attention to you. And then you have an extensive appendix section that outlines everything that people need to know. Or you can compile a one-pager to distribute after the presentation, summarizing everything so people don't need to look through every slide in your deck to understand what's going on. They just have all the key insights in one place. So different ways to work around it, but The key is to take into account the different settings in which the information is presented.
And how does it evolve, like in today's world, after especially pandemic? A lot of us are working in distributed environment where our teams are kind of spread across the world, right? So not everybody's going to make to the presentation times because it's middle of the night for somebody every time, whatever time you choose. So how should one think about, like, is the solution to actually do what you said, like create an appendix or create a one pager and share it with them? And if that's the case, then how do you make the folks who are just getting the tail end of this, which is, here is an appendix, here is a one pager, sorry, we couldn't loop you into the meeting. Like, they will always feel left out.
It's so hard in our increasingly global connected world, but in an interesting way, we're slightly more disconnected in the way that we have these daily interactions. I remember one organization I worked in tackled it by trying to align the meeting times so that we're all awake. So we were working with teams in India. We made sure that our meetings on the East Coast of the United States were in the morning so that we could catch them in their evening. But if that's not possible, if we can't all be present at the same time, we do need some kind of report or document that outlines everything for people to read. I recommend incorporating more storytelling techniques into that so people still get the experience of hearing your progressive narrative. Every slide, for example, I recommend having the title be a strong, actionable takeaway, action-oriented. A lot of times I see slides where the title describes what is depicted on the slide or the graph. So saying something like number of sales last quarter as a descriptive title. But for someone who's reading that for the first time, who hasn't listened to the presentation, it'd be more helpful to say, sales have dropped last quarter, so we should, or something. So indicate not just what's going on, but why is it important and what should we do about it on the slide. Have the call outs, annotations, notes on the slides indicate what is presented during the meeting so anyone can follow along. So thinking about how will people read this eventually is vital to creating the best design that matches those needs.
You mentioned storytelling multiple times in the last few minutes. So how should somebody who is not good at storytelling become good at it? Especially there are, in our tech world, there are a lot of people who have immigrated from different parts of the world, and English is not their first language, including me. English is not my first language. How should people who grew up thinking, reading, writing another language now suddenly become good at storytelling in a professional world?
This will be an unconventional recommendation, but I recommend reading stories and watching movies to understand how narratives are created in those fictional settings. Also because it's entertaining. We enjoy watching those things to begin with. So it's also a medium to learn. And by reading stories, you can see how someone takes a main idea and lets it blossom into different subplots to different characters. If you watch a movie, you can see how it's structured. Usually, at the beginning, you set things up with the introduction. There's some context that's delivered. Who are these characters? Where are we? It builds up to a climax eventually, moment, where there's some kind of reckoning. You defeat the villain, you overcome a problem, and then there's a resolution at the end where you overcome all those things. It's an arc journey. All the big blockbuster movies follow that because there's a setup, there's some kind of conflict and confrontation, and then it's resolved. At the end, everybody learns something from that experience. And that's the storytelling formula. By seeing that on screen, watching that play out in different perspectives, different characters, different settings, different mediums and genres, you begin to internalize that and you say, how can I incorporate that in a business setting? Well, it's the same formula. At the beginning, you can set things up, give some context for your audience, build up some climax, orient your presentation around one main idea that you want people to remember, and then resolve all the challenges and conflicts that you brought up. Business is all about solving problems, making people's lives easier, more efficient, more money, more revenue, more profit. And how can you achieve that? How can you let people achieve the goals they've set out to do?
I think that's a good tip, like reading stories, watching movies. That kind of brings up a question in my head. A lot of times, you're not the only one who's doing the presentation. Usually it's like a set of slides, and every few slides, there is a new speaker who's going to come and talk about those. how do you kind of build storytelling in which the narration has to be done by multiple people, or everybody has different presentation styles? If let's say out of 20 slides, I'm going to present three, and I usually have like 5 to 7 minutes. How do I think about building a good story and making it more engaging and convincing?
I believe that stories are not just one arc. So I mentioned there's the context at the beginning, there's a climax moment, there's some kind of conclusion. I believe stories consist of many stories, and that's what keeps people engaged. If if we take a big blockbuster movie, let's say the Avengers or the Marvel movies that are incredibly popular, and let's say the one of the more recent ones several years ago was Infinity War. The big climax in that movie is you try and defeat the villain whose name was Thanos, who's trying to destroy half of life in all the universe. That's the big climax the movie's building toward. If that was it, people would be bored. So there needs to be little stories and little subplots along the way to keep people interested, tensions and releases along the way, conflict and resolution. That's how you keep people engaged. So throughout the movie, you have little stories. You have this subplot where one of the heroes goes and builds a weapon for himself. So there's the tension. Am I going to be able to build that weapon? You resolve and you build the weapon. There's all these little battles along the way. So in a business setting, for your part of the presentation, think about how you can create a mini story. Think about what context are you setting up? What insight do you want people to remember after your part of the presentation is done? And how can you conclude it with some next steps or recommendations? And ideally, you work with everybody else who's giving the presentation so you can all align under a common arc that you want people to remember. So that collaboration there is key.
Do you have any examples from your time where, like, or what is your favorite presentation that you have done or come across?
A presenter that's probably on the top of all of our minds in tech is Steve Jobs, who did a phenomenal job with all his presentations. And he was an example of how much preparation is needed to deliver something stellar. I was reading things about how he would prepare for hours and days for just one presentation because it's an experience that he wants people to have. And it needs to be of a high caliber to meet the expectations he's built around his audience. So what Steve Jobs did so well is he incorporated storytelling. He would always have something memorable for people to take away. He would have surprise, suspense. He would incorporate anecdotes. He would create villains out of his competitors. And all of those things come from storytelling. And we resonate a lot with his presentation style because it taps into something deep-seated in ourselves that yearns for stories and meaningful resolutions to conflict and tension.
We talked a lot about presentations. When it comes to communication, there are other parts of communication, like verbal communication, written communication, right? Having difficult conversations. What sort of tips somebody you can provide for somebody who's looking to get better at overall communication?
Biggest tip would be to focus on listening. I think something that we do a lot, especially generally speaking in US business culture, is there's a lot of talking that happens during meetings. We want to show our expertise, but a lot of value can be found in just listening. And if we're talking to someone else, just having the space to be quiet, listen to what they're saying, and not just listen so that we can wait for our turn to eventually speak. So we're not really listening. We're just thinking about what we want to say, but genuinely going in with curiosity, without judgment, so we can understand their point of view. I think if there's more of that in US business culture, there'll be a lot more innovation that can be had because we can see different point of views, we can merge it with our own, and then create something new from it.
Great you bring up listening, because I believe that communication is a two-way street. It's just listening and speaking, or sharing your point of view. But tell us a little bit more about why you brought up listening, and how does active listening kind of play a pivotal role?
I think listening for me is a very personal subject because I am an introverted person. And growing up, I did a lot of listening, not a lot of speaking. And it's also culturally influenced. In the culture that I grew up in Asian and Chinese culture, there is a high value for respect for authority, and there's the idea of not speaking out of turn, making sure that you don't rock the boat too much, you just listen. And it was difficult for me when I started working in US business companies because they want you to speak, they want you to bring up problems and challenges and voice them and disagree. And that was very uncomfortable for me for a time. I just preferred listening. I had to learn to have both sides, as you mentioned. It's a two-way street for conversations. You need to speak and you also need to listen. And I believe that having the best of both worlds is where we can move things forward. The reason why active listening is so important is it allows us to enter conversations without agenda. I think what often happens in business is we go into the meeting, we say, all right, I want to persuade someone of XYZ, and I'm just going to listen until they stop talking, and then I'm going to bring up my point, and then we're going to close the meeting after they're convinced. But if you go in with the perspective of active listening, you don't go in with agenda immediately. You're going in to understand them, to really hear them out, and maybe you can go in a different direction. I believe that when you speak, you only say what you know, but when you listen, there's always the opportunity to learn something new. And you need that in business if you want not just the old way of working to persist, but a new way of working to come forward.
This is interesting because this is probably in contradiction to a generally adopted practice that every meeting should have a well-defined agenda. Otherwise, don't go to it.
I would say meetings must have agendas.
Mm-hmm.
So to clarify, yes, that I was in one company where we had meetings without agendas, and they would go on for 30 minutes, an hour longer than they were supposed to. And it was actually at that point that I brought up to leadership. I said, hey, these meetings are going on much longer than expected. It's spilling over into time that we need to be using to develop the code that we need to do our work. And my suggestion was, let's have a clear agenda sent out to all attendees before the meeting so that we can keep it to the time frame. So agendas are essential. A general sketch of what we want to talk about, what we want to accomplish, the takeaways from the meeting. Active listening comes in handy in certain situations, not all, I'd say. In a meeting, we're goal-directed. We want to get something done. We have a conversation and something that needs to be discussed. Where active listening can come in handy is perhaps in coaching settings, in one-on-ones with your employee or with your manager, where the manager just sits down with you and just listens to you. There's perhaps not a set agenda, something we need to accomplish from this one-on-one every time. But in that space, you can develop that trust with each other, that relationship, and listen to understand, not necessarily to have them do something at the end.
Interesting. I think you gave me several nuggets for several follow-up questions. But I want to build on to this this idea of, I think you talked about leadership a lot. So a lot of my audience on this show are the people who are first-time managers and whatnot. The way I look at effective communication is, yes, you need to get better at listening. But additionally, you also have to coach people in whatever they need to be coached. There are people always on team who like to talk more than listen. And then, like that, there are people who like to just listen and not talk at all. How do you balance that art? Like, how do you learn to fly an aircraft while you are still?
One thing about listening is, I think there are 3 levels of listening. There's the bottom level, which is just listening so that you can eventually talk. So listening to reply. And that's a type I don't recommend, because then you're not really listening. Then there's the second level, which is listening to understand. And that, I think, should be the case in, generally speaking, in all situations. The third level is what I was mentioning in coaching environments where there's not a set, let's say, agenda, where you can not just listen to understand, but just listen. So there's no goal. You're trying to learn from each other in this space together and discover something new, hopefully. You're going in with genuine curiosity. And that is pure listening, let's say. But in generally speaking, in meetings, we want people to listen to understand. And that's where the coaching comes into play to recommend practices to implement. And things that we can encourage are, when you're listening, it's not just about hearing and just being silent, but there are things you can do to understand. One would be to summarize what people have said. So you can say, if what I believe you're saying is, and then you try and paraphrase what they've said, and then see if you're on the same page. If not, they can correct you, and then you benefit from that knowledge. Another thing you can do is just the verbal affirmations. If someone is talking, you say you agree with them, or you nod your head saying that you physically indicating that you are listening. So there are several techniques like that: listening, paraphrasing, summarizing, validating, that you can use to demonstrate your listening skill, and also make sure that everyone feels like it's that two-way conversation.
So I want to delve a little bit more because I understand, I fully agree with the first stage that you define listen to reply. That's not recommended. But how do you differentiate between listen to understand and just listen? Like, how do you learn something if you don't understand it?
I think it's more of a terminology in listen to understand that influences our mindset. So if we are listening to understand, it's goal directed. And because we're seeking to understand, we are not fully present in the conversation, you could say, because we're focused on that end goal. An analogy I like to use is, let's say you're in an interview with a company you really want to work for, talking to the CEO. They ask you a question. You're so focused on the goal, which is getting the job, that you mess up in the actual execution. That happens to us all the time. We're so focused on what we want that we're not in the present moment being able to be effective. And I believe the same could be said of listening. If we are listening to understand, we're always thinking about, am I understanding? Am I understanding? We're not just absorbing the words that they're saying in a pure sense, because there's that goal interfering. So it's about letting go of that, having it in the back of our mind, of course, but not having it front and center where it can interfere with our ability to be present.
That's great. I think you also talked about the follow-up things that you could do just to make sure that you are understanding the speaker. What is the importance of non-verbal cues? Like, yes, you talked about, some verbal cues. You can kind of paraphrase what they said. You can ask follow-up questions, right? But what are some of the non-verbal cues which could give a hint to the speaker that yes, the person is present here with you and listening to you and not checked out?
There's the nodding, which I think both of us have been doing during the conversation, and also the eye contact. Virtually, that becomes more difficult because right now I'm not actually looking at you, I'm looking at the camera at the top of the screen. But maintaining that appearance of connection through eye contact is great for virtual settings and important. And so the nodding, the eye contact, those are all great for nonverbal cues. In in-person settings, it can be clear that where our body is directly facing the other person. We're geared into them. Nothing else is distracting us. I was talking to someone just the other day about how their manager, their nonverbal cue that demonstrated they weren't listening was there was no eye contact. They were just looking at their phone during the one-on-one meeting. And that just, it's discouraging when that happens, because then you feel like you're talking to a void. They're not actually listening to you. So I recommend being fully present and using the nonverbal cues that indicate that precisely.
So I think I want to delve into that because I recently read something about removing the distractions when it comes to communicate, especially when it comes to physical cues. And you talked about phone for an example, right? So what are some of your tips that kind of build on to like remove the distractions?
Another tip I needed to implement for myself was to turn off the sound or close whatever chat messaging software I was using that would give notifications, and allowing time for just deep concentrated work. What happens when I'm trying to focus and then suddenly I hear a message go off, I see the blinking cursor indicating someone wants to talk to me, it just breaks the concentration, prevents you from getting into that deep work. So having those blocks in your calendar where you're going to say, okay, I'm going to turn off all the notifications, turn off my phone, I'm just going to focus on this one task, that's key. And because distractions just break that flow.
I would add one to it. This was shared to me with one of my mentors. It's like we all have smartphones these days. And most of the times in a lot of meetings, I've seen it personally, and I'm guilty as charged. We pull the phone out, we put it on the table, even we put it upside down, like we face down. But that's a big barrier. That kind of creates a barrier between you and the other person. His advice was turn your phone to silent. Do not disturb if possible. Put it in your pocket. It should not sit in between you and the other person. So I think that I've been trying to follow that. Like, for example, in our family now, we have created a rule that on the dinner table, no phones. Put the phones in the kitchen. When everybody's done eating, you can pick up your phone, go. Like, we are not implementing those time jars or anything, but on the dinner table, no phones. Cool. So let's kind of build into this a little bit more. You also, you started kind of getting into it, like in this conversation, we are not face to face. We are doing this virtually. So we are looking at our screens and our cameras. But this is the reality today. Like, how do we make sure that the other person, and it's easy to hide, like if I'm not listening to you, I could hide that. Like I could have another window open here. It might look that I'm listening to you, I'm looking at you, but I would be looking at my WhatsApp, my Slack, whatever. How do we kind of make sure that we are giving, first of all, we are genuinely listening to the conversations. Second, we are giving the right cues to the other person on the other side of the screen that I'm here with you, for you.
Eye contact, I believe, is key here. So making sure that you are looking at the person and ideally closing everything else out on your computer so that this is the only thing that you're currently working on. So to your point about putting the phone away, even if it's visible and it's turned face down, putting that entirely away so it's not even a temptation. That's all important. Another thing that's a hindrance in virtual communication is we're cut off in this little box here. I can't see everything that's going on, just this small shoulder up version of ourselves. And that limits a lot of our ability to communicate. I personally love in-person speaking engagements. I've been doing a lot more of them recently, and it's just so different from virtual. You feel the energy in the room. It's like an electricity that goes through everybody when you're really passionate about the subject, and you can feel it. In virtual settings, it's through another medium that is that blocker. And I recommend for people to create that connection, even in virtual settings. It's important to remember that we have our hands, and both of us have been using our hand gestures in this episode. And it's so important to remember this. If we're just talking heads, that limits our ability to express ourselves. So once we bring in our hands, that adds another level to demonstrate what we're talking about. So that's important. And there are all kinds of virtual collaboration tools as well to make people engage. So there's polls, there's chat, there's games and activities that you can do during a presentation or any kind of meeting setting to get people all over the world engaged together. And bringing those in to recreate the feeling of being all in one place is
important. I will just do one follow-up question on this, and then we'll shift gears once more. Has the pandemic, like, how has pandemic changed your working style? Like, what are some of the tips that you have, kind of included in your working style every day that helped you cross this bridge? Because I think what I have learned is building connections in a virtual world is 10 times harder, if not more, than it was in a physical world where we all would go into office, and I could go have a coffee with somebody, go have lunch with somebody. Like, and there's so many opportunities which are not confined to a formal meeting.
It really changed the way that I approached building relationships, as you mentioned. When I was working in the office, you could just go to someone's cubicle, talk to them, hang out after work. But since the pandemic, every single activity needs to be purposeful and on the calendar. We need to schedule it in. And while that can feel like a hindrance, I think it creates opportunity for us to be even more purposeful with the relationships that we build. And we just have to put in the effort and energy to keep those up. So if I want to develop a relationship with someone, make sure that I devote the time on their calendar to that. Make sure that I have that block present. If that's not present, then I most likely that connection will fade. So I think the pandemic created some obstacles, but also opportunities for us to be even more purposeful with our relationship building.
All right. In this episode, we have so far talked about presentation skills. We have talked about speaking and listening. So let's shift gears and talk a little bit about written communication, because that's also equally, probably equally, if not more important, professional word, because you are sending emails every day, you are sending Slack messages every day, and you don't get time like you get for creating presentations when you're responding to an email or responding to a Slack message or Teams or whatever you use. So how should one get better at written communication?
I believe that written communication is similar to verbal in that, especially in the business world, clear and concise is king. I was talking to a lot of leaders in different companies who are very upset with how written communication is done. Long emails, can't find what the person was asking, or messages that just go on with a lot of detail and you can't find what they're recommending to you. So my recommendation for verbal and written communication is figure out what is the one thing you want people to take away and put that bottom line up front. Often in emails, for example, we'll have the nice greeting at the top. Hey, how's it going? Hope your week's been going well. And then we talk about some context, and then we finally get to what we're asking them about. And by then they're lost. So reverse the order, put the thing you want first, say, this is what I'm looking for. Here's some more context, and then hope you have a great day. So just reversing the order how we normally think of doing things and making it as concise as possible. That's how we improve.
Wonderful. And I'll kind of pile on to that as well. One thing that I have learned in my career is write for the reader, not for yourself. Right? Especially when it comes to writing documentation, not so much for emails. Like it could be wiki pages, it could be Word documents, Google Docs, or whatever. A lot of times people write it for themselves and it's a brain dump from them. And it's so hard for the reader to follow. So, write it from the reader's perspective, not from your perspective, and that will make miles of improvement. Cool. I have a few more questions for you. We are already more than halfway into the show. You and I, you kind of earlier mentioned a role of cultural background in terms of how you were growing up and how it kind of created who you are. And you and I both come from different backgrounds, but very similar in terms of growing up or kind of the structure of the culture. How should one, as a leader, think about role of cultural background, and when it comes to who a person is, how they behave, and then how do you coach them? Like both are in our cultures. When we were growing up, there was sort of a hierarchy. Like you would not go and argue against elders, like especially your parents. Like you will take what they say at its face value. You may agree or disagree, but you would not argue back, right? But whereas people growing up in the Western side of the world, they were always taught, having an individualistic point of view and always put your words across. How do you kind of work through these nuances of different cultures?
Cross-cultural communication is such an important part of the work that we do now in this connected world. We're going to work with people from different cultures. And I like to think of culture as another facet of a person's identity that we should pay attention to communicate with them more effectively. There's also age. So depending on their age, they value different forms of communication, depending on what generation they come from. You can think about all these different kinds of identities that they have and they're bringing forth to the table. What we can do as leaders is seek to understand them and have those conversations where we understand where they're coming from, why they act in the way they do. As an example, I worked with a client who was really nervous about being assertive. She came from an Indian background and she was extremely afraid of speaking up to her manager. And in meetings, he would ask her questions. He would raise a lot of things that he wanted to think about, and she would just agree and move on. And eventually, the manager became frustrated because there were certain deliverables that weren't taking place, and he was grilling, and she was shutting down because she couldn't explain herself confidently in those kinds of settings with that kind of hierarchy present. And when I worked with her, it really came through to first understanding where she's coming from, it was a background similar to mine, so I could empathize with that, but really understanding her point of view. And we worked on building frameworks and structures and techniques to not change the way she is, because that's her cultural upbringing, that's what should be respected, but how can you adapt to the culture that you're working in and still be an effective person within the team? So I equipped her with frameworks that said, this is what you can do to communicate in an assertive yet respectful way to that person to talk about what's going on. You're both working to the same goal. There's nothing offensive about that kind of communication. But of course, it's still difficult. We're not used to it. It comes through with practice and that kind of coaching. Another thing that occurred recently with another client is he was telling me he flies all over the world to speak with businesses. And when he comes to the US, it's one of his least favorite places to go because he's from Latin America. And in Latin America, meetings go on very long. There's a lot of socialization, a lot of chit chat. Things are drawn out. You don't get to the point until the very end. It's more of a roundabout way of communication. And he said to me, he does not like when he comes to the US because they just want you to go A, B, C, let's sell it. That's it. Get to the point as quickly as possible, be efficient. And I talked to him about it, and I said, in an ideal world, we would all make the effort to understand each other's culture, meet in the middle somewhere. So perhaps if you're coming in with your team, they're coming in with their team, US and your Latin American team, they understand that you don't get to the point as quickly, typically in your communication. And you understand they want to be very quick with their communication and make decisions fast. Let's meet in the middle in some kind of timeline. That often doesn't happen. So in those settings, I equipped him with different kinds of frameworks to be concise with his communication so that he could still be effective in those settings so he can adapt. And it really boils down to the fact that communication is not one size fits all. You really need to personalize it to your audience. So to your point earlier about how you write for your audience, not for yourself, communication is the same way.
This is a nice segue in terms of asking you a very personal question. I think all of us have built our personalities with a lot of impression coming from people who have influenced our lives, our parents, our significant others, our partners, our friends. So who are the top three people, or top three most influential people in your life?
The first would probably be an English teacher I had in high school. His name was Dr. Melman. And at that part of my life, I was extremely introverted, extremely shy. I didn't talk at all during class. But this teacher noticed that I had potential. So he helped me out. He gave me some mentorship and some coaching, and he let me feel like I could be more than what I was at that time. That was a really inspirational person to me. And the second teacher that has been inspirational to me in that time period was a chemistry teacher I had, whose name was Dr. Sharma. And she also saw that potential in me. She said, I remember her words. She pulled me aside after one class and she said, your reports and all your work is stellar, but nobody's going to know about it unless you communicate about it, unless you raise your hand during class and say what's on your mind. And it's going to help you in your professional career to be able to speak and communicate effectively. At that point in my life, several years after my first teacher, Dr. Melman, I was at a point where I was ready to start working on this skill. And so she helped me unlock my confidence as a speaker, to realize that I had something important to say. That what often happens for me as an introverted person, is I don't like stealing the spotlight. I like letting other people shine. But I realized that I have something unique to bring into the world, and it would be a shame to let that go to waste. So there has to be both, and I can do both. She was the second most influential person in my life, and the third would be my wife. By all accounts, she's been the most influential person in my life. She inspired me. She inspires me every day to do what I do, to go for what I want and seek out my dreams. I was working for a long time in corporate and in tech, and she saw that something was missing from my life, that I would be unfulfilled if I'm 80 looking back and saying I never tried out what I wanted to do. She gave me the push I needed to start my business, do this work I do now in leadership communication coaching. And I'm eternally grateful to have met her and to have her in my life. That without that, I would still probably be doing what I used to be doing a few years ago.
Wonderful. Great. I think some golden words there, and especially connected with your chemistry teachers were, right? If your work is stellar and nobody would know about it if you don't speak up, think that applies so well in our corporate world, in our careers, in our business. Like if you don't sell what you do, nobody's going to find out. Great. My second question to you, also on a similar lines of being a little bit personal, like if time and resources were not a constraint, what would you rather do?
I would be doing what I'm doing now. And I think when I say that, I realize that I have found my bliss in a sense. I found the Japanese term of ikigai, where it's this intersection of what the world needs, what they'll pay you for, what you're good at. And I've identified that for myself, finally, after all these years. I found this place that I feel like I can make a difference, I can impact people's lives. And that, to me, is, having said that to you out loud for the first time, it makes me realize that, yeah, it's been a lifelong journey, but I've reached a place where I would do this if I could, even for free.
Awesome. And for our readers, if you don't know what ikigai is, the word ikigai means the reason to be, like why do you even exist? I highly recommend reading the book Ikigai. I read it about 2 years ago. It definitely changed how I look at life, at what I do, and what I want to do or what I want to continue doing. I highly recommend it. Third question for you, along the similar lines, Chris. Where do our audience find you online if they want to learn more about you, if they want to connect with you? What are the best ways to connect with you?
Best way would probably be through LinkedIn. I try to be as active as I can, posting content on communication, presentation, storytelling, especially related to the tech and data industry. And there's also my website, thehiddenspeaker.com, where I have a lot more free resources, articles, and a YouTube channel that accompanies that, where I hope that anyone who's interested in working on their communication skills can use that as a starting place.
Awesome. And for our audience, I will link down all the places where you can find Chris in the description below. So go connect with him. He's one of the best when it comes to improving your communication. All right, Chris, we are coming almost to the end of the episode. The last couple of questions for you. What sort of resources, books, frameworks, blogs would you recommend people who want to improve their communication?
I'm going to say something unconventional here. I believe that books would come third in my recommendation. Second would be watching people speak who you really admire. So going out and on YouTube, in your local community, in your business, watching how they communicate. What are they doing with their voice, their body language, their structure, their presentations, and try and emulate that. Take pieces that work for you and merge that with your style. Number one, though, would be you practicing it every day yourself. And the best method I recommend is through recordings of yourself on video, speaking about anything you want. It could be a diary entry, how did your day go? A story that happened that day. I use this in my class, in the online class that I teach on communication and storytelling for tech professionals. And I found it's worked marvelously for improving confidence and efficacy with communication. If I have people every week create a video, the improvement is exponential over time, because we're our own worst critic. We're going to do several takes of that over and over and over until we get it just right, so we can find it acceptable for other people to watch. And with the additional guidance that I provide, it puts them on the path to becoming confident communicators. So that would be my number one recommendation. Number two would be watching people who you admire so that you can adopt it to your own style. And then three, the books I recommend would be books by Nancy Duarte. She has been a presentation guru in the space, fantastic material on how to speak well, especially in technical settings. For a lot of the more data-oriented folk, how to tell stories with your charts and your graphs and your data. There's Cole Nussbaumer-Knaflich's book, Storytelling with Data, as well as Brent Dyke's book, Effective Data Storytelling. Different perspectives on the same topic, which is how do we take our often dry and complicated technical subject matter and put it into an engaging format that has aha moments for people. those would be my recommendations.
And I can relate to a lot of it. And I would add one more, which I've personally tried. If you don't find it comfortable recording yourself, go talk to the mirror. Right? Stand in front of the mirror, practice your speech, practice your presentation. At least that way you can look at yourself. And that's how I grew up. Like, cameras were not common when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, but mirrors were always there. Awesome, Chris. Last question. What is that one parting advice you want to leave with our audience?
I want everyone to know how powerful your voice is. I believe that most of us go through life just talking for the sake of talking. We are taught grammar and vocabulary and syntax, but we don't focus on how to communicate effectively and confidently, how to use this marvelous musical instrument that we have in the most effective way. An analogy I like to use is playing piano. Any of us could go to a piano and touch the keys and play a melody, but the professional piano player knows the technique. They know how to hold their hand in the right way, how to connect each note to the next. And the same needs to be true of our voice. To focus on that skill, because we have this marvelous amount and wealth of knowledge, expertise, ideas in this head, in our brain with these thoughts. And most of the time it's fed into the world through poor prisms. So you can imagine the white light from the sun gets filtered through a prism, becomes a rainbow of colors. Most of the time, the prism we use for our thoughts is a voice that is unconfident, that is unstructured, that's unconcise, and it's not up to the full potential it could be. We need to upgrade these 8-bit prisms we usually use to the full capacity that they could be by working on our communication skills. Once we feel that, we feel the confidence, the authenticity behind every single word we say, the results for our confidence and our view of ourselves are invaluable. And this is key for not only our professional career, but also our personal one. When you can speak confidently, you feel great about yourself in any setting that you're in.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. Thank you for sharing these wonderful insights with our audience. I really appreciate you coming to our show. Thank you again. And for our audience, if you are new to this channel, please subscribe, like this video. That will help us grow this channel. And in the comments, do let us know if you have any additional piece of advice, additional questions. We'll try to answer those. Thank you.